Hello and welcome to this video tutorial for the Space Combat Kit for Unity, where I'll be showing you how to set up weapons in your game. So I've got a very simple scene here with the player and a space fighter, and you'll see on the player game agent I've set the starting vehicle to the space fighter, which means that when the scene starts, the player will take control of that vehicle. So let's run the scene and see what happens. If we press the mouse button 0, we fire the guns, and if we press the mouse button 1, we fire the missiles. So what I'd like to show you in this video is how that's all set up. So the way that weapons are set up in this kit is using a triggerable module system. So basically you have modules that you can load onto the vehicle. We covered modules in the video titled Overview of a Vehicle, so if you'd like to get familiar with them, I recommend watching that video. Basically we have triggerable modules that we can create for our games, and then we can trigger those modules with input. So triggerable modules can be weapons. They can be projectile weapons, energy weapons, missiles, so on. But they can also be other kinds of modules. So if you've got something like Elite Dangerous, where you want to fire a scanner at the same time that you fire a weapon, you can set that up using the triggerable system. So it's a very versatile, very flexible way of setting up any module that needs to be triggered in your game. So let's take a look at the vehicle, the space fighter. And you'll see in the inspector we've got this Triggerables Manager component. Now this component here basically manages all of the triggerable modules loaded onto the vehicle. So it's a module manager component, which means that it'll be notified when modules are loaded onto the vehicle, so it can update its references to the components that it needs to communicate with and manage. So before we go on and have a look at the inspector in detail, I'd like to show you the triggerable component. So let's grab an energy projectile weapon. And you'll see on the in the inspector on the root transform, we've got a triggerable component. Now this component is what the triggerables manager on the vehicle is going to be looking for and communicating with. So let's take a look at what the triggerable component does. The first thing is we've got a default trigger, which is an integer. So this is an index that determines which input fires which triggerable. So you have inputs and you can set those inputs up to fire triggerables at a specified index, and then you can set the trigger index for the triggerable. So when those indexes match up, you fire that triggerable with that input. So what this allows is that even during gameplay, the player can set up which inputs fire which weapons and set them up in groups to be fired on a particular trigger. We'll cover that in a different video because I want to just stick to the basic concepts in this video. But just keep in mind that you've got the input which fires triggerables on an index, and then you set the index on the triggerable, and that determines how the input fires the triggerable. Let's take a look below that. We've got the ordering index. That's basically just an index that helps you set up the way that the triggerable modules are displayed in a menu. And then you've got these events here. These are 4 events. You've got the on start triggering, which is when, for example, you press a button down and it starts the triggering of the modules. And then you've got this event for when you stop triggering, so when you release that button. Then you've got an event for when you trigger the input once, so you might set it up so that when you press the trigger down, you fire it once and that's it. And then you can set the trigger level, which, for example, if you've got a beam weapon or something like that that can go from 0 to 1, then you can set that trigger level directly. If for any reason that's what you'd like to do, you can set that value from 0 to 1 and set the trigger level of this triggerable component. So you'll see in these events it's set up basically so that when you start triggering, it starts launching projectiles here. When you stop triggering, it stops launching projectiles, and when you trigger it once, it launches one projectile. So this is a very versatile component. You can add whatever functions you like to those events. Yeah, it's a very flexible way to set up weapons and other kinds of triggerable modules. So in a different video, we'll cover how to set up this particular weapon and all the other weapons in the kit. But in this video, we're just going to stick to the triggerable system and make sure we understand that. So that's how the triggerable module is set up. Let's go and take another look at the vehicle, at the Triggerables manager here, and what it does. So as we covered, this is a module manager component which is notified when modules are loaded on the vehicle, and then it will update its references to those triggerable components on the module, store them away, and then pass the input to them from the player or the AI. So let's take a look at these other settings. We've got these triggers. Now what these do, I added these recently due to popular demand. So it lets you configure how you fire triggerables on a particular index. So if you've got multiple triggerable modules and you want to fire them in sequence or fire them all at once, you can set that over here. So basically it's a data container for how you want the triggerables to be fired on a particular index. So we've got the trigger index. So at trigger index 0, we won't fire them sequentially, or we can check that to fire them sequentially, one after the other. And then we can set the interval between them, so maybe 0.2, and then it'll fire them one after the other with 0.2 seconds between them. So that just lets you configure exactly how you want to set the triggering of the modules on a particular index. Next, we've got the starting triggerables array. This is just a list of triggerables, triggerable components. Now, if, for example, you just don't want to use modules or module mounts or anything like that, you just want to add your weapons on the vehicle and trigger them, you can just add the weapon directly to the vehicle and drag the triggerable components into this list, and they'll be managed properly, just like all the others. And then we've just got this checkbox here, which lets us enable and disable the triggering of the triggerable modules on the vehicle. So that's the Triggerables manager. It basically lets you pass input through the vehicle to all the triggerable modules that you have loaded at that time. Let's go and have a look at the player and how the input is set up. So you'll see in the hierarchy of the player game agent, we've got all these input scripts set up. Now, we already covered vehicle input in a different video, so check that out if you haven't already. It'll really help you understand how input is set up, and it's a very important thing to understand. And then you'll see underneath the player, we've got a lot of different inputs for different kinds of vehicles. And some of them are general vehicle controls. Now, these are controls that are not specific to a particular kind of vehicle. And they include the Triggerables controls, because the triggerable system is not specific to a kind of vehicle. It's used for the character, it's used for the space fighter, the capital ship, and it can be used for any kind of vehicle that you have in your game. So let's take a quick look at the inspector and see what we have here. So first of all, we've got these vehicle input settings, which we already covered. They're for the base class, the vehicle input base class that all the input scripts derive from. So we covered that in the vehicle input video. But underneath that, we've got these trigger inputs. Now what these are, basically they let you set up an input to fire the triggerables on a particular index, trigger index. So as you recall, we have on our triggerable component, we can set the default trigger, which can be any integer. And then on the triggerables controls, we can set the input for a particular trigger index, and if that matches the triggerable component on the weapon, then that weapon will be fired with this input. So we've got a custom input here where we have set up the mouse button 0 to fire the triggerable modules on index 0. Now in the demo, that's going to be guns, and then we've got the another one where we set up the mouse button 1, the right mouse button, to fire the triggerables on trigger index 1, and that's going to be missiles in the demo. So you can set up things the way you want, but you have the input and you've got the trigger index, and you match that up with the default trigger on the triggerable module, and that lets you configure how you want to fire the triggerable modules on your vehicle. So that pretty much covers it for the triggerable system. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a different video.